ghost, a July night, and a man who swore he spoke to the dead. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. This growing, mystery-loving community is amazing. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your words truly bring this channel to life. I read everyone. Let's begin. Maigret sat in his shirt sleeves by the half-open window, a grey wool blanket folded on the back of the chair, untouched. It was the 4th day of July, yet the weather in Paris had not bothered to remember it was summer. A thin drizzle moved like breath across the glass, gathering in soft streaks before vanishing into nothing. Below, in the courtyard, a child's rubber ball lay abandoned in a puddle. He watched the rooftops of the Rue des Récollets with idle attention, his elbow resting heavily on the windowsill. The cafe across the street hadn't yet opened for the day. A lone pigeon pecked at breadcrumbs beside the gutter. It was a slow morning, the kind Maigret liked best. Nothing expected of him, no summons from the Quai des Orfèvres, no telephone call cutting through the peace with its shrill insistence. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of boiled chicory and damp wool. Madame Maigret had gone to visit her sister in Montluçon the day before, leaving the inspector to fend for himself. He didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed these rare moments of solitude, moments when he didn't need to speak or be spoken to, when his world shrank to the hum of the city outside his window and the quiet rhythm of his own thoughts. His pipe had gone out again. He didn't relight it. From time to time, Maigret glanced at the newspaper folded on the table. It remained unopened. A headline about a strike in Nantes, something political below the fold. But he hadn't the appetite for news today. It was almost 11 when the telephone rang. Not sharply, hesitantly, as if the call itself were uncertain. Maigret didn't move at first. He stared at the phone, as though the longer he waited, the more likely it would stop. But it didn't. He crossed the room slowly, his heavy steps soft on the worn linoleum. He picked up the receiver without a word. "Maigret," came the voice. Male, older, a trace of wheeze in the throat. "Yes." "This is Emile Vasseur. We've met, but you won't remember." Maigret said nothing. The name rang only the faintest of bells. Perhaps something from years ago, tucked in a file drawer of his mind, not yet opened. "I used to be concierge at the Rue Caulaincourt boarding house. You came once, after that girl, after her death." Maigret still said nothing, letting the silence stretch. People always revealed more when you didn't press them. "I know you're not working these days," Vasseur went on, "but I didn't know who else to call. It's odd, silly perhaps." A breath. Rain brushed against the window again like the whisper of a coat sleeve. "There's a man here. He came last night. Room number 5. No luggage, no coat. I asked if he'd be staying long. He looked at me and said, 'Only until I speak to the ghost.'" Maigret lowered himself slowly into the chair by the phone. Vasseur cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the silence. "I know what it sounds like, but there's something about him. He hasn't slept, just sits there, doesn't eat, looks out the window. I went in this morning to change the linen, and he asked me if ghosts can lie." Maigret could feel the room grow smaller around him. "I thought perhaps you'd remember the girl," Vasseur added quietly now. It was July then, too. Maigret still didn't answer. He remembered now. Not the man, but the girl. Juliette, 19. Found in her room with the window wide open, though the air had been hot. No sign of struggle. No cause ever determined. The case had been closed with a quiet shrug. "I'm not asking you to come," said Vasseur quickly, as if he'd heard the shift in Maigret's breath. "I just thought, well, perhaps you'd want to know." He hung up without waiting for a response. Maigret sat there for a long time, the dial tone humming in his ear before he replaced the receiver. He didn't move. The rain tapped the glass once more. then receded. A patch of blue appeared above the rooftops. He stood at last and crossed to the closet. His old brown coat still smelled of tobacco. He slipped it on, heavy on his shoulders. Then he reached for his hat. There had been no crime, no alarm. Just a man in a rented room who said he had come to speak to a ghost. Still, Maigret felt something, not fear, not urgency, just a quiet pull at the edge of his thoughts. The kind of feeling he'd learned to trust. He left without finishing his coffee. The cafe across the street was still shuttered. The rubber ball in the puddle had drifted closer to the drain. The walk to Rue Caulaincourt took Maigret past shuttered bakeries and damp flower stalls, the petals drooping in the cool mist. Paris was always quieter after a morning rain. Not silent, never silent, but subdued, like someone had laid a heavy hand over the city's pulse. He moved without haste, letting the rhythm of his steps carry him forward, the hem of his coat brushing his knees. His pipe remained in his pocket, unlit. Today didn't feel like smoke. It felt like questions that hadn't been asked yet. The boarding house stood as he remembered it, though it had been nearly 12 years. Pale grey with darker stone trim, its windows set too deep, giving it the appearance of a building perpetually watching the street through tired eyes. A chipped brass plate beside the bell still read Maison Vasseur, though Maigret suspected it had not been polished in at least a decade. He didn't ring. The front door gave slightly under pressure, and with a low creak, Maigret stepped into the vestibule. The air inside was warm and musty, the kind of air that had known too many winters without ever being let out. A small electric bulb buzzed above, throwing weak light over a narrow corridor lined with faded wallpaper, floral and peeling at the corners. The scent of boiled cabbage drifted from somewhere behind the walls. From a room to the left, a shuffling sound. Then Émile Vasseur appeared, thinner than Maigret remembered, but still with the stoop and stiff gait of a man who spent too much time seated. His eyes, watery and rimmed red at the edges, lit with something like relief when he saw the inspector. "I didn't think you'd come," he said softly. "I didn't either," Maigret replied. Vasseur nodded as if that made perfect sense, then gestured with a tilt of the head. "He's still up there. Room 5, same one as before." Maigret didn't move just yet. He studied Vasseur's face for a moment. The man's lower lip trembled slightly. Whether from age or unease it was hard to say. Something else hung in the air between them. Not quite fear, but the unease of memory dredged up too soon. "When did he arrive?" Maigret asked. "Last night, 11:30. No suitcase. Paid in cash. Said he'd only be here a day, maybe 2. I gave him Juliet's old room without thinking. It wasn't until he said—" He paused, shaking his head. It was the way he said it. Not dramatic, just quiet, like he was certain the ghost was still there. Maigret nodded once. "He give a name?" "Lemoine, Marc Lemoine, but I didn't check an ID." "Show me the ledger." Vasseur disappeared briefly and returned with a slim black book. Maigret flipped it open. The handwriting was blocky and deliberate. "Marc Lemoine, July 3rd, room 5. Nothing more." He handed it back. "Has he spoken to anyone else?" "No one. Not a word since this morning. Just sits there. Not even the blinds pulled. I heard him speaking to someone through the door, softly, but when I went in with the linen, he was alone." Maigret glanced at the staircase, then back at Vasseur. "Did you say anything to him about the girl? About Juliet?" "Not a word." Maigret hesitated, then removed his hat. "I'll go up." The stairs groaned under his weight, the kind of sound that seemed exaggerated in such a still house. The wallpaper here was different, a faded green that curled inward like ivy drying on stone. On the second-floor landing, a narrow hallway ran 6 doors deep. Maigret didn't need to look. He remembered room 5. He stood before the door a moment before knocking, 3 times, firm but not loud. A pause. Then the sound of something shifting inside. Footsteps. A quiet click as the latch turned. The door opened. Marc Lemoine was younger than Maigret expected. 40, perhaps 45. Thin-faced, clean-shaven, with dark eyes that blinked too slowly, like someone perpetually emerging from a long night of thought. He wore a brown sweater, the sleeves pulled past his wrists, and dark trousers that hung awkwardly, as though they'd once belonged to someone broader. He looked not startled, but unsurprised to see Maigret standing there. "You're not the concierge," Lemoine said softly. "No," Maigret replied. "May I come in?" A long silence passed. Then Lemoine stepped aside. The room was small, as most were in such houses. A narrow bed, a writing table beneath the window, a wardrobe with one door slightly ajar. The curtains hung limp, open to the overcast light that poured in, pale and indifferent. The only personal item visible was a folded newspaper on the desk, untouched. Maigret walked to the center of the room but didn't sit. Lemoine remained near the door, one hand resting on the knob, as if still considering whether to leave. "You told Vasseur you came to speak to a ghost," Maigret said. Lemoine didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the corner of the room, not to the bed, not to the window, but to the empty space in between. "I suppose I did," he said at last. Maigret turned slightly to study him more fully. "Was it a metaphor, or do you believe she's still here?" "I don't know what I believe," Lemoine said. "Only that this was the room. Heron, I remember the shape of it. The window, the mark in the wallpaper where the old mirror hung." "She was a friend." "No." A long pause. "I never spoke to her." "Then how did you know her?" "I saw her fall." The words were simple, unadorned, and they landed like dust settling on a still floor. Maigret's eyes didn't shift. "You were here that night?" "I was across the street. I lived above the grocer then. It was late. I couldn't sleep. I remember the window open, the way the curtains blew outward just before she went. And you didn't come forward?" "No." "Why now?" Another long pause. Outside, a car passed in the street, tires hissing against the wet road. Lemoine turned toward the window. "I dreamed about it. For years I didn't. Then 2 weeks ago I did. Every night since. She was sitting here in the corner, not saying anything, just watching me." Maigret didn't speak. The silence had always done more work than the questions. Lemoine's shoulders hunched slightly. "I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, a forgotten detail. But then I heard the name again. Juliet. It was in a newspaper, an old obituary reprinted for a family anniversary. I don't know why I saw it, but it was like the dream was asking something of me." Maigret moved slowly to the window, looking down on the street. The grocer's shop was still there, its awning now faded and patched. A new name above the door, but the bones of the building were unchanged. "She didn't scream," Lemoine said, almost in a whisper. "She just fell." Maigret turned back. "Would you be willing to stay another night?" Lemoine nodded without hesitation. Maigret's eyes drifted once more to the spot on the floor where Lemoine had been staring. "Good," he said. "Then let's see if the ghost speaks back." Maigret stayed for a few more minutes after that. He didn't press further, nor did he offer Lemoine any assurances. He simply stood there, quiet, letting the weight of the room settle back into its corners. When he finally stepped out into the hall, he did so softly, as though afraid to disturb something fragile. He left the door open behind him. Lemoine didn't close it. Vasseur was waiting at the foot of the stairs, pretending to polish the banister with an old rag. He looked up as Maigret descended, expectant. Maigret didn't speak until they were back in the front room. Do you remember anyone living across the street at the time of Juliet's death? Vasseur frowned. Above the grocer? That was a long time ago. He rubbed at his chin. There was a family in the corner flat. Husband, wife, 2 daughters. But I think they left before the summer. And then, yes, there was a man. Quiet type. I remember him because he always came home late. Suited, polished shoes like someone working in a bank. He didn't stay long. Did you know his name? Number I don't think we ever spoke. Maigret nodded. Would you let me know if anyone else checks into room 5 over the coming weeks? Vasseur blinked. Do you expect someone else? No, Maigret said, but sometimes the past likes to come in pairs. He stepped out into the street, the drizzle having lifted to a pale brightness. The cobblestones glistened faintly, and the awnings of the grocer's shop fluttered slightly in the breeze. Maigret stood on the opposite pavement and looked up toward the windows above the shop. The curtains were drawn. He doubted the current tenants knew what had happened all those years ago. It wasn't the kind of thing people passed on with the lease. At the corner cafe, now open, Maigret took a seat outside beneath the awning. He ordered a coffee and sat with it untouched, watching the boarding house. Occasionally, someone walked past, a delivery boy, a woman with a small dog, a man in a painter's smock, but none of them looked up. Only Maigret's gaze seemed to return to that second-floor window again and again. The case had never felt right to him, even back then. Juliet had been found alone, fully clothed, her shoes placed neatly beside the bed, as though she'd prepared to rest. But her body had been discovered in the courtyard below, face down, arms tucked strangely beneath her. There were no signs of violence, no forced entry, no suicide note, no visible distress in her recent behavior. It had been declared a probable accident, an ambiguous conclusion that served no one but cleared the docket. Maigret sipped his now lukewarm coffee and watched as a pigeon landed on the edge of the curb, pecked at something unseen, and fluttered off again. He returned to the police archives. That afternoon, more from instinct than intent. The building, tucked behind the Quai des Orfèvres, was dim and humid, the fans turning slowly overhead, as though they too had lost the energy for urgency. A few clerks were sorting folders at the far end of the room, their conversation no louder than paper shuffling. Maigret made his way to the shelf marked 1948, Unresolved Incidents. He pulled the volume marked July-August, a thick ledger bound in worn cloth, and carried it to the long table by the window. It opened with a reluctant creak. He found the entry easily. July 14th, 1948. Juliette Fournier, age 19. Found deceased in the courtyard of 17 Rue Colincourt. Time of discovery, 6:20 a.m. Initial call placed by Émile Vasseur, concierge. No sign of forced entry. No visible injuries beyond consistent fall trauma. Coroner's note. Estimated fall from second-floor window. No witnesses. Concluded accidental or suicidal fall. The folder attached to the case was thin. A single page of notes from Maigret himself, a coroner's summary, and a brief sketch of the courtyard showing where her body had landed, closer to the wall than expected. At the time, he remembered thinking she might have leaned too far out the window, trying to shake a rug or call to someone. Now, he wasn't so sure. There was no mention of Marc Lemoine. He double-checked the list of interviewed persons. Vasseur, a neighbor from room 4, and a woman from the laundry service. All had said more or less the same thing. Juliet was quiet, polite, occasionally smiled but didn't invite conversation. No boyfriend, no enemies, no visitors. But the absence of a name, Maigret thought, didn't mean the absence of a presence. He left the archives with the photocopied case file folded into his coat. Outside, the sky had cleared completely. The sun was low and golden, washing the rooftops in a pale glow that made their imperfections look almost romantic. Back at his apartment, Maigret warmed yesterday's soup and ate in silence. The flat was too quiet without Madame Maigret. Her small touches, a folded napkin here, a vase of garden flowers there, were missing, and the air had taken on the neutral stillness of an unused hotel room. He poured himself a glass of beer and returned to the open file on the table. Something about the photograph of the courtyard nagged at him. He stared at it longer than necessary. Then he pulled a sheet of paper toward him and began to sketch the angles, window, trajectory, distance to the wall. If she'd simply fallen or jumped, wouldn't she have landed farther out? The position of her body, closer to the base of the wall, arms beneath her, suggested she hadn't leapt, she'd slipped, or been pushed. But the autopsy had shown no defensive wounds, no bruises inconsistent with a fall, no fibers, no fingerprints. Still, there were ways of making someone fall without touching them. Words, for instance. Or silence. That night, Maigret sat by the window in the dark, listening to the slow tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of traffic. He did not write a report. He did not make a call. He simply waited, the image of Lemoine in room 5 taking shape again in his mind, the vacant stare, the slight tremor in the voice, the confession wrapped in dream and memory. The man hadn't spoken to Juliet, hadn't known her. Yet now, after 12 years, he returned to the same room, haunted. Maigret exhaled slowly, the window fogging faintly in the cooling air. People didn't come back like that unless they had something to finish, something they'd avoided too long. And ghosts, he thought, don't speak unless spoken to. The next morning, the air was clearer, but still held a heaviness that lingered low in the sky, as if the weather had made its own decision to wait and see. Maigret rose before the street sweepers and dressed slowly, without thinking. His coffee was bitter, and he drank it in silence, already turning the night's thoughts over in his head. The sketch of the courtyard still lay on the table beside the case file. He didn't need to look at it again. The image had settled in his mind, stubborn and unanswered. By 8, he was back at Rue Caulaincourt. The bakery down the street was opening its shutters, and the aroma of warm bread drifted faintly through the breeze. He paused only a moment before pushing through the familiar front door again. Inside, the air felt much the same as it had the day before, close, faintly sour, as if the walls themselves had absorbed too many unspoken things. Vasseur emerged from the back room the moment Maigret stepped in. There was something cautious in his face now, a hesitancy that hadn't been there yesterday. "He's still up there," the old man said. "Didn't leave the room. Didn't eat dinner either." Maigret nodded once. "Anyone speak to him?" "No one. I asked him this morning if he needed anything. He said only, 'I'll be gone by tonight,' then closed the door." Maigret didn't respond. He moved toward the stairs, the old treads protesting again beneath his weight. On the landing, the hallway was quiet, the air stagnant. Room 5's door was closed. He knocked once, no answer. He knocked again, softer. There was a pause, a brief rustle behind the door, and then it opened. Lemoine looked the same, paler perhaps. His hair was mussed, and the circles under his eyes had deepened into hollows. He stepped aside wordlessly, and Maigret entered. The room was untouched, the bed still made, the newspaper unmoved. The curtains had been drawn halfway, and the morning light fell across the floor in a flat, dusty stripe. Maigret gestured toward the chair. "May I?" Lemoine nodded and closed the door behind them. Maigret sat, not looking at the man directly. He waited. "I've been thinking about her," Lemoine said at last. "Not who she was. I didn't know that. But how she must have felt." Maigret let the silence breathe. "I remember. She stood in the window the night before," Lemoine went on, voice quiet. "Smoking, I think. Or maybe just holding something. Her silhouette, it was delicate." He trailed off, eyes drifting toward the wallpaper. I never spoke to her, but I saw her enough to recognize when something changed. Maigret glanced at him. Changed how? She looked. Lemoine hesitated. Disoriented that last night. She kept walking in and out of view, like she couldn't stay still. Once, she leaned out so far I thought she might fall right then. I almost called out, but I didn't. Why not? Lemoine shook his head. It wasn't my business. Maigret studied him, then leaned slightly forward. You saw her fall. Yes, but you didn't come forward. I was afraid, Lemoine said simply. Not of trouble, of becoming part of it. I told myself there was nothing I could have done. But then, I couldn't sleep for a year. And now I think I did worse than nothing. I looked away. Maigret let those words sit. He stood slowly and walked to the window. He opened it halfway and leaned out, just slightly, as if to feel the air, as Juliet might have felt it that night. The courtyard below remained the same, narrow and damp, and filled with shadows even in the morning. He turned back. You didn't touch her, Maigret said, not as a question, but with the soft certainty of someone nudging at a barrier. No, Lemoine replied, but you saw someone who might have. Lemoine's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Maigret's gaze remained calm. There's a kind of guilt that doesn't come from action. It comes from knowing. Lemoine lowered himself onto the bed, his posture collapsing inwards. There was a man, he said, after a long moment. Not a guest. I never saw him come through the front, but he was in this room, late that night. I saw him from across the street, just his shadow, pacing, once standing very close to her. Did you recognize him? Number. But he wasn't a tenant. He had the look of someone trying not to be seen. Maigret nodded slowly. And you still said nothing. I told myself I was imagining it, that it could have been a friend, a brother maybe. I didn't want to believe it was something worse. But now you believe it was. Lemoine looked at him directly for the first time. Yes. Maigret considered that. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a small notebook. He opened it to a blank page and jotted something down. Do you remember the time? Lemoine thought. I saw her in the window a little after midnight. The man appeared some time before 1. She was no longer visible after that. And the fall? I didn't see it. I heard it. Around 2. I looked out and she was there, in the courtyard. Still. The window was open, light on, but the room was empty. Maigret closed the notebook. You'll stay another night? Lemoine hesitated, then slowly nodded. Maigret returned to the ground floor. Vasseur met him at the door again, more nervous now. There was someone else back then, wasn't there? Maigret asked. A visitor who came often, someone not on the tenant list. Vasseur frowned. There were a few. But you mean someone in particular? Maigret looked him in the eye. A man. Middle-aged. Didn't use the front door. Came and went late. Vasseur's face shifted. Not surprise, but memory resurfacing. I do remember someone, he said slowly. Juliet would leave the door unlatched for him. I pretended not to notice. He wore a grey coat. Always kept the collar up. Did you know his name? Number But. Once I heard him say it to her. Something like Arnaud or Arnoul. A short name. Sounded clipped, precise. Did you ever see his face? Only in profile. He had the look of someone important, or trying to be. Walked like he owned whatever room he entered. Maigret stepped out into the street. The cafe across the way had just opened for the lunch hour. He didn't stop. His thoughts were not yet shaped, but they had begun to circle something. A man no one had wanted to name, a presence too shadowed to record officially. And a girl, 19, poised too close to the edge of something no one wanted to claim. If Lemoine had carried the silence of what he saw, then someone else had carried the silence of what they did. And Maigret, with the slow weight of understanding beginning to settle in his chest, knew the time had come to ask the question no one had dared ask 12 years ago. Who had Juliet been waiting for that night? And who had she let in? He turned his steps toward the Ministry of Finance, where men in grey coats walked in and out every day, and where names like Arnaud were common and easy to forget. It was past noon by the time Maigret reached the administrative quarter, where rows of limestone buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, each one indistinguishable from the next, save for the wear of soot or the tilt of a rusted shutter. The Ministry of Finance loomed as a block of faded authority, its broad iron doors opening and closing in quiet regularity, as men in dark coats and pressed collars moved in and out with practiced anonymity. Maigret stood across the street, unlit pipe at his lips, watching the flow of it. He wasn't expecting recognition. Too many years had passed since he'd been called here in any official capacity, but his presence was still marked, noticed, if not acknowledged. A few glances, quickly averted. Perhaps someone whispered his name inside, the way one names a statue at the foot of the staircase. He crossed the street eventually, stepped through the tall doorway and into the cool marble vestibule, where the scent of paper and polished stone lingered. A receptionist sat behind glass, flipping through a file without urgency. "I'm looking for records," Maigret said, voice calm but pointed. 12 years ago, someone employed here. I don't know his full name. Arnaud, perhaps Arnoux. Mid-40s then, grey coat, unofficial hours. The clerk looked up. She didn't ask for a badge. She didn't need to. His face was the kind people remembered. Or perhaps it was the weight of his stillness that registered more than the features. "We've had several Arnauds," she said. "Still do." "Any still living in the 18th arrondissement at that time?" She turned to her register, running fingers slowly down the page. There was an Arnaud Blanchy, lived on Rue Lepic, briefly. Transferred to Rouen in 49, Maigret nodded slightly. "Where is he now?" She hesitated, glanced to her left, then back at Maigret. "Retired, lives outside Saint-Cloud. I believe he manages a small antiques shop now. Do you have the address? I can give you the last one we recorded, but it may be outdated." Maigret waited as she scribbled the details on a torn piece of carbon paper and slid it toward him beneath the glass. Her eyes followed him as he turned and walked away, the doors closing softly behind him. Outside, the afternoon had begun to wane. A wind had risen, scattering dry leaves across the square, though it was too early for autumn. Maigret took a cab to Saint-Cloud. The ride was long and mostly silent, the driver not one for conversation. Paris grew looser the farther out they went, buildings giving way to hedgerows, boulevards relaxing into quiet streets. The shop, when he found it, sat on the corner of a quiet lane, its window filled with faded maps and chipped porcelain. The sign above the door read, Maison Blanchie, Curiosités and Objets Historiques. A bell chimed faintly as Maigret stepped inside. The space was dim, cluttered with objects that had no business being in the same room, a brass sextant, a broken violin, dusty volumes on Napoleon. The air smelled of varnish and old wood. A man emerged from the back, tall, still neatly kept, though the lines in his face had deepened into grooves. His silver hair was combed back carefully, and his eyes were small and quick, alert in a way that felt practiced. "Good afternoon," the man said, voice mild. "Looking for something in particular?" Maigret didn't smile. Not something. Someone. Blanchy blinked once. "You found him, then?" Maigret stepped closer. "You used to work for the ministry." "Years ago," Blanchy said. "That was another life." Maigret nodded slowly, gaze steady. "And during that life, you visited a young woman in a boarding house on Rue Colincourt, late at night, Never the front entrance. Always discreet. Blanchy stiffened. It was subtle, a tightening at the jaw, a shift in balance from one foot to the other. But Maigret saw it. "You're mistaken," Blanchy said too quickly. "I don't know the place." Maigret reached into his coat and unfolded the photocopy of the old case file. He laid it gently on the nearest counter, turned so that the name Juliette Fournier was visible. Blanchy didn't look at it. "I was never there," he repeated. "You were seen," Maigret said, voice low. "Not then, perhaps. But now, the man who watched you from across the street remembers you." Blanchy's mouth twitched, not a smile, something tighter. "She was an unfortunate girl," he said finally. "Tragic. You knew her." Blanchy said nothing. "Did you see her fall?" Silence. "Did you push her?" Blanchy's lips parted as if to answer, but the words caught in his throat. He turned, walking to the far side of the shop, picking up a figurine from a shelf as if it needed dusting. He held it delicately, then placed it down again. "No," he said at last, "but I was there." Maigret didn't move. "She asked me to come," Blanchy continued. "That night, she said she needed to talk. I don't know what she wanted. Maybe she expected something I couldn't give. Or wouldn't. You were involved with her." Blanchy shook his head. "Not in the way you think. I helped her once, gave her money. It became entangled. She misunderstood. Or maybe I let her misunderstand. It was a confusing time." Maigret waited. "I left before it happened," Blanchy said quietly. "We argued. She cried. I told her to get hold of herself. I left by the back stairs. That's all." "Did you threaten her?" "I didn't need to. But you did frighten her." Blanchy looked up then, something bitter in his expression. "Yes, I think I did." The two men stood there for a long moment, the air between them filled with the weight of things unsaid. Maigret spoke softly. "You could have come forward and ruined what was left of my life, my wife, my position." Blanchy shook his head. "No one would have believed it was nothing." "She believed it was something." Blanchy turned away. Maigret folded the paper slowly, placed it back in his coat. "You won't be arrested," he said. "There's no charge that can hold, but guilt doesn't always need a courtroom." Blanchy didn't answer. As Maigret stepped out into the fading light, the wind had risen again. The lane behind him was empty. Somewhere, a bell rang distantly. He walked slowly back toward the station, his thoughts heavy but unhurried. Juliette had been alone that night. Not physically, not at first, but in every way that mattered. Abandoned not by action, but by cowardice, by silence. Lemoyne had watched and said nothing. Blanchy had argued and walked away. And Maigret, though 12 years too late, had finally heard what the ghost had been waiting to say. Maigret returned to Paris as dusk settled in, a warm, tired kind of dusk that didn't promise rain, but offered no comfort either. The train clattered through the suburbs with a steady rhythm, and he let the movement settle into his bones. He didn't take notes. He didn't replay Blanchy's words. He simply stared through the grimy glass at the fields and rooftops, letting the slow weight of what he'd learned sink deeper without struggle. There was no case, strictly speaking, no body to recover, no warrant to issue, no confession to formalize, just a dead girl long buried, a man who had turned away, and another who had left her standing in an open window. And yet, Maigret felt no sense of completion, only the dull ache of something long left unresolved, finally admitting its shape. He didn't return home. Instead, he walked slowly from the station back toward Rue Caulaincourt, passing a line of cafes where couples sat with wineglasses catching the last of the light. The streets here had changed only slightly. A new awning, a shop replaced, but the corners remained the same, the angles of the buildings, the way the light curved around the eaves as it disappeared, familiar but emptied. Vasseur was just locking the front door When Maigret arrived, he seemed startled at first, then relieved. "He's still here," the old concierge said, before Maigret even asked. "Didn't go out once, just sat by the window." Maigret nodded. "I'll go up." He climbed the stairs again, the creaking wood greeting him like a chorus of memory. At the top, the hallway was dimmer than before, though the light hadn't changed, just his mood. He knocked. Lemoine opened the door as if he had been standing just behind it. He looked thinner somehow, his face worn, his posture slack. He said nothing, only moved aside. Maigret stepped in and closed the door behind him. The room smelled of closed air and folded regret. The curtains were open, the window too, and the chair near it was turned inward, facing the bed, as though someone had waited to be spoken to and never had been. Maigret sat. "I spoke to him," he said. Lemoine didn't answer, didn't sit. He admitted being here that night. He left before she fell, or jumped, or was pushed. He says they argued, that he frightened her, that he didn't mean to, but he did. Lemoine turned his back, walked to the window. "He didn't kill her, not with his hands," Maigret said softly. "But he came into this room with power she didn't have, and he left her with nothing." A long silence. "I watched the light in this window for weeks," Lemoine said finally. "Afterwards, I kept waiting for it to come on again. Some nights I thought it did. I thought she was still there, still deciding." Maigret looked down at his hands. "We all told ourselves things." Lemoine turned from the window. "Do you believe she meant to fall?" Maigret met his eyes. "I believe she had been made small enough to slip between the cracks. Whether she jumped or simply gave in doesn't change much now." Lemoine sat on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping the blanket. "I wanted to ask her forgiveness," he said. "Not because I caused it, but because I watched. I kept her secret as if it were mine." Maigret let the room rest in silence for a moment. Then he rose. "She doesn't need your forgiveness. She needed someone who would have knocked on her door." Lemoine's eyes fell. "You can leave tomorrow," Maigret said gently. "You've stayed long enough, but don't pretend this didn't happen. That's what killed her in the end, not the fall, the quiet after." He stepped toward the door, then paused. "I'll have Vasseur keep this room empty from now on, just in case." Lemoine didn't answer. He was staring at the window again, as if trying to see past the glass to the world that might have been. Maigret left him there. Outside, the street had emptied. The air was warm, still. The shutters were drawn on the windows across the way. No one watched. No one leaned out. The city had turned its back for the night. Maigret walked without direction, letting the quiet carry him. He stopped once for a beer, small, bitter, too cold, but didn't linger. He didn't need to think about Blanchy or Lemoine, or even Juliette anymore. They had taken their places in the slow, heavy ledger he carried inside him. Not as villains, not even as victims. Just people. Fallible, ordinary people who did the worst things in the smallest ways. It was nearly midnight when he reached home. The light in the hallway glowed faintly yellow, and the apartment smelled of old paper and something faintly sweet. Madame Maigret had returned. He found her asleep in her chair, a book open in her lap. She stirred as he entered, blinking once, then smiling softly. "You're late," she murmured. He nodded, removing his coat. "It took longer than I thought." Was it a case? Maigret looked at her, then at the book, then at the window, where the faintest breeze moved the curtain just slightly. "No," he said, "just a voice that needed listening to." She closed her book gently and stood, smoothing her skirt. "Coffee?" "In the morning," he said, and touched her shoulder as she passed. He stood there a while, alone in the quiet, listening, not to the city, not to the clock, but to the space where a silence had finally spoken, and where, for once, someone had stayed to hear it. The following morning, Maigret rose early. The sun filtered in through the window with an unexpected gentleness, casting soft gold across the tabletop where his wife had left a folded napkin and a note. Gone to the market. Tomatoes are ripe today. He read it twice without reason, then let it rest against his coffee cup. He hadn't intended to return to Rue Caulaincourt again, not officially, not as a matter of duty. But some stories, even when resolved, leave behind a hum in the air, like a sound you can't locate, but feel somewhere between the ears. The boarding house was no longer a place of evidence or witness, but it remained the one space where everything still echoed, where something unfinished hadn't yet dimmed. He didn't tell Vasseur he was coming. There was no need. When Maigret arrived, the old concierge opened the door without surprise and nodded silently toward the stairs. It was a small gesture, but one that held a strange kind of understanding, as if both men knew there was a rhythm to be respected, and it hadn't quite ended. Room 5's door was ajar. Maigret knocked lightly, then stepped in. Lemoyne was already dressed, his suitcase on the floor, a folded coat resting across the bed. The room looked as it had before, ordinary, untouched, but something in Lemoyne's face had changed. Not peace exactly, but the burden of avoidance had lifted. The man looked tired in a quieter way. "I wasn't sure if you'd come again," he said, voice steady. "I wasn't sure either." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Lemoyne reached for the suitcase handle. "I'm leaving," he said. "The train just after noon. I've written a letter." "For her?" "Number for her mother." Maigret's eyebrows rose just slightly. "She's still alive," Lemoyne added. "I looked her up. She lives outside Poitiers now, alone. I don't know what I'll say. I don't expect an answer." Maigret gave a slight nod. "You don't write letters like that for answers." Lemoyne looked down at his shoes. "I wonder if she knew that her daughter wasn't just lost to time, but to everyone around her." "She probably knew," Maigret said. "Mothers usually do, even when no one tells them." Lemoyne didn't speak for a while. Then he gestured toward the window. "I kept looking at it, you know, trying to understand what she must have felt in those last moments, what it's like to stand there and not see a way forward." Maigret followed his gaze. "It's not about what she saw," he said quietly. "It's what she'd stopped seeing, the small mercies, the faces that might have looked back." Lemoyne picked up his coat and turned toward the door. "Do you think that matters now?" Maigret didn't answer immediately. "It matters to you, and it matters to the kind of man you want to be after this." They stepped out into the hallway together. The corridor, with its peeling wallpaper and faint odor of floor polish, felt less oppressive in the morning light. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Vasseur stood holding a small envelope. "This was slipped under the door last night," the concierge said, offering it to Maigret. He took it, frowning slightly, and opened it. A single sheet, typewritten. "To whom it may concern, I was there too. Not that night, but others. She wasn't just alone, she was used. Not just by one man, but by 3. They were careful, quiet. They made promises they didn't keep. I worked at the cafe near the station. I saw them come and go. Always late, always separately. I tried to forget it. But I can't anymore. There's no one left to punish. Just truth, I suppose. That's all." Monsieur Maigret folded the letter slowly. Lemoyne looked over. "Do you believe it?" "I believe it fits." Maigret's voice had hardened slightly. "Blanchy wasn't the only one." Vasseur looked nervous now. "What will you do with it?" "Nothing official," Maigret said. "But I'll keep it, in case the silence starts to rise again." Lemoyne hesitated, then extended a hand to Maigret. "Thank you. Not for forgiveness. Just for standing still long enough to hear it." Maigret shook his hand once, firmly. After Lemoine left, the house grew quieter. Vasseur disappeared into the back. Maigret lingered in the foyer, glancing once more at the stairs. Then, slowly, he turned and stepped outside. He didn't walk home directly. He took the longer way, past the old cafe where Juliet had once bought her morning bread, past the newsstand with its faded front pages no longer shouting the old names. Paris was the same, and it wasn't. A city never mourned as one body. It mourned in corners, through whispers and borrowed memory. Later that afternoon, Maigret sat at his desk, the envelope with the anonymous letter resting in his drawer beside the closed case file. He didn't plan to reopen anything, but he would not discard it either. Madame Maigret brought in a tray with 2 cups, one already prepared the way he liked it, warm, with just a splash of milk. "Everything all right?" she asked. Maigret looked at her, the warmth in her eyes, the steadiness of her presence, and thought of the window again. Not the fall, but the waiting. The night spent behind the glass, unseen. "Yes," he said, "everything is where it needs to be now." She smiled, kissed the top of his head, and returned to her book. Maigret sat in the soft light of late afternoon, sipping slowly, quietly, and thought not about guilt or justice, but about presence, about how some tragedies do not announce themselves with sirens but with absence, and how sometimes the only thing left to do is be there when someone finally returns to listen. And he had listened. That would have to be enough. The next morning, a soft rain fell over Paris, not the kind that washed anything clean, but the kind that lingered like memory, gently soaking through the skin. Maigret watched it from his window, coffee untouched, the city moving slowly below in softened silhouettes. He had not slept poorly, but something in him resisted rest. The letter still sat in his drawer, its single paragraph unsettling in its restraint. A quiet confession, unsigned, from someone who had seen too much too early and waited too long to speak. He thought of Juliet, not the facts in the file, 19, no known family in Paris, no confirmed employment. He thought of the girl others had described only vaguely. Quiet, smiled politely, a little sad, the kind of description people gave when they hadn't truly looked. And now a new detail had surfaced. 3 men, not 1. It shifted the balance again. What had been a private grief, Blanche's cowardice, Lemoine's silent guilt, now pointed to something wider, more corrosive. A pattern, not an exception. Juliet had been failed not by one man, but by a world that knew how to exploit without leaving fingerprints. He dressed deliberately. Light coat, the brown hat that sagged slightly at the brim. He didn't bring a notebook. By 10 o'clock, he was seated at the café near the Gare de l'Est, a modest place with metal chairs and round tables that had once been painted red. The waitress who approached him was young, no more than 22, her apron folded neatly, a pencil tucked behind her ear. Her hair was pinned in a manner that suggested effort without vanity. "Coffee?" she asked. Maigret nodded. He watched her work. Efficient, polite, the same sort of presence Juliet might once have had. And suddenly he realized how many thousands of such young women passed through places like this, never quite invisible, but never truly seen either. Smiling just enough, moving just right, never being asked too much, and never asking anything at all. When she returned, he said, "Did you work here last year?" She blinked at the question, then smiled. "No, monsieur, only a few months." "Who's been here longest?" She thought a moment, then pointed toward the counter. "Renée. She's been here forever." Renée was wiping down a tray when he approached. She looked up slowly. Mid-40s, short frame, her blouse too tight at the shoulders, face lined by habit more than age. She studied him briefly before saying anything. "I knew I'd seen you before," she said. "Inspector Maigret." He offered only a small nod. You worked the Saint-Michel robbery 12 years ago. I was still working nights back then. You used to come in after the shifts ended. He smiled faintly. Your memory's sharp. She shrugged. Some things stick. He leaned in slightly. I'm asking about a girl who worked here. Juliette Fournier. René's face didn't change much, but she sat down slowly, placing the tray on the counter with care. She didn't work here, René said, but she sat here, often. Mornings mostly, coffee and half a brioche, sat by the window. Did she speak to anyone? Not much. She'd read or write in a notebook. Sometimes she met men, never the same one twice. Sometimes older, sometimes closer to her age. Always quiet conversations, sometimes arguments. Once, she left crying. Maigret said nothing, just let the pause lengthen. René looked away. I didn't interfere. None of us did. You see too much in a place like this, and you learn not to lean in. Do you remember any of the men? She thought, her brow furrowing. One wore a grey coat and gloves, even in spring. Neatly dressed, tall, angular, face. He didn't look like the others. She seemed afraid of him. Blanchy. Is that his name? She asked, then shook her head. He only came twice, but she changed after that. What do you mean? René picked at a thread in her sleeve. Before she was reserved, yes, but whole. After him, she stopped meeting anyone here, just stared out the window. Sometimes she came in and didn't order anything at all, just sat with her coat on. It wasn't long after that. Well, she fell. René looked up. Did she? Maigret met her gaze. It's what the record says. And the record is always right? He didn't answer. She exhaled, long and tired. I wanted to say something once. When I saw her walk past my stop one night, toward the hill, she looked lost, like she didn't recognize the buildings anymore. Why didn't you speak? I'd convinced myself it wasn't my place, that someone else would, but no one did. Maigret gave a faint nod. Someone left a letter. Anonymous, said she was used by more than one man, that it was known, that no one did anything. René went still. I didn't write it, she said quietly, but I believe it. He stood, placing a few francs on the counter. Thank you. René didn't stop him as he walked out. She just resumed wiping the tray, but more slowly now. Outside, the rain had picked up again, a fine mist rather than a pour. Maigret walked without hurrying. He wasn't going back to the archives. He didn't need more files. The truth was already layered across too many hands. What remained was not justice. That was long out of reach. What remained was illumination, a slow peeling back of every silence that had gathered around the girl in room 5. She hadn't been a mystery. She had been seen, passed by, spoken to, abandoned, and now, finally, a few had begun to speak of her. That would have to be the beginning of something, a different kind of case, one that didn't end in a conviction, but in a reckoning. As he reached the corner of Rue Colincourt, Maigret paused once more and looked up toward the window, the one she had stood behind, waiting, listening, deciding. It wasn't lit, but it no longer felt empty. That night, Maigret couldn't sleep. It wasn't the case, not in the traditional sense, but something quieter, more persistent, a residue, the kind of unrest that came not from questions unanswered, but from answers that revealed something heavier than resolution. He sat by the window again, his pipe unlit in his hand, and watched the street lamps flicker through the light rain, which now came in intermittent sighs. From somewhere down the street, a cat mewed once, then went silent. He thought again of René's words. She looked lost, like she didn't recognize the buildings anymore. It stayed with him, not for what it said about Juliette, but for what it revealed about those around her. People had seen the unraveling. Some had even noted the pattern, but none had placed a hand on her shoulder, or even said her name out loud. It was the same with the anonymous letter. The signature absent, not from fear perhaps, but shame. Someone had spoken too late to change anything, and knew it. The telephone rang just before dawn. Maigret didn't startle. He picked it up with the steady hand of someone already half awake. Inspector Maigret? The voice was unfamiliar. Young, male, hesitant. My name is Vincent Artaud. I work at the post office distribution center near the boulevard. I was told you're asking questions about Juliette Fournier. Maigret straightened slightly. Who told you? There was a pause. I saw the old letter in the file cabinet. The one from 12 years ago. It never made it to her mother. It was never sent, but it was addressed. Maigret was silent. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. And when I saw her name, I remembered something. Maigret waited. My older brother, Louis. He used to come home late in those years. Never said where he'd been. He was in his 20s then. He lived with us in Montmartre. One day, my mother found an envelope in his drawer. Inside was a photograph of a girl sitting by a window, alone, writing. I remember it clearly. She had this kind of lost expression. Juliette, Maigret murmured. Yes, my mother thought she was his girlfriend, but he denied it. Said it was just a girl he'd helped. But after that summer, he changed. He stopped going out, became distant, eventually moved to Lyon. We never talked about it again. Where is he now? Still in Lyon. He's a printer now. Married. I haven't spoken to him in years. Maigret didn't rush his next words. Why are you calling me now? Another pause. Because I think he was part of it, Vincent said quietly. And I think he's been carrying it ever since. I don't want to accuse him, but something happened to that girl, and I need to know if he was one of the men who let it happen. Maigret wrote down the name and address slowly. Thank you, he said. Not just for the call. I don't know if it helps. It does, because now someone else is willing to stop being silent. After hanging up, Maigret didn't dress immediately. He sat by the window for a long time, watching the city wake. The bread carts rumbled past. A child, half asleep, walked with her mother toward the tram line. Life, endlessly unfolding, never looking back. But Maigret had always been drawn to what the city left behind. By noon, he was on the train to Lyon. The ride was long but uneventful. The countryside drifted past in a blur of damp fields and slow-turning clouds. He watched it with the calm patience of a man who had spent a lifetime waiting for the moment when someone's guard would lower enough to let the truth escape. He found Louis Artaud's shop easily. Imprimerie Artaud, a modest storefront tucked between a hardware store and a patisserie. Inside, the air was thick with ink and the heavy smell of paper. Machines clacked and hummed in the background. Louis was behind the counter, sleeves rolled, eyes narrowed at the register. When Maigret entered, he looked up briefly, expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" Maigret removed his hat. "You knew Juliette Fournier." The words landed with a stillness that shifted the entire room. Louis's face didn't change right away, but his hands, one resting on the counter, the other gripping the edge, tightened. "I haven't heard that name in a long time," he said finally. "You had a photograph," Maigret said. "Your brother remembers." Louis looked away. "I don't want to talk about this." "But you will." There was a long silence. Then Louis nodded toward the door behind the counter. "In the back, not here." They stepped into the narrow room beyond, where paper stock and reams of envelopes were stacked in neat rows. The light here was dimmer, softer, and Louis seemed older in it. "I didn't hurt her," he said, before Maigret had a chance to speak. "Then what did you do?" "I watched her, for weeks, at the cafe, I thought she was extraordinary, quiet, graceful in a way that made her seem apart from everything around her. One day I left a note on her table, with no name, just a few words. She read it, smiled, and that was all. You never spoke. Eventually, we had coffee once. She told me she didn't need saving. That was her phrase. But I think part of her wanted someone to care. Maigret said nothing. Louis sighed. I wasn't brave enough. I saw her getting into a car with one of those men. I recognized him from the ministry, and I knew what it meant. She wasn't their equal. She was being used. You said nothing. I wanted to, but I wasn't part of her world. I had convinced myself I didn't have the right to interfere. You had a heart, Maigret said. That was enough. I wrote her a letter after she died. I put it in an envelope and wrote her mother's name on it, but I never mailed it. Why? Louis looked down at his hands. Because I was ashamed. Because I knew that the only thing I'd ever done for her was not enough. Maigret placed a hand lightly on the counter. You're not the first, he said, but maybe you can be the last to stay silent. Louis nodded slowly. Maigret left the shop without another word. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streets of Lyon shimmered with that peculiar post-rain light, when everything looks like it's been briefly forgiven. He stood on the sidewalk, letting the stillness wash over him. Juliette had become more than a girl in a file. She was a mirror, showing people what they had failed to see in themselves, and one by one, those reflections were finally being named. It was late when Maigret returned to Paris, the city, breathing slowly beneath a silver sky. He didn't go home immediately. Instead, he walked once more past the boarding house. The windows were dark now, the curtains drawn, but as he passed beneath the ledge of room 5, he paused and looked up once more. Not for signs, not for ghosts, but for the simple, human acknowledgement that someone had finally stopped walking past. The rain didn't return the next day. Paris woke beneath a brittle blue sky, the kind that looked clean, but felt hollow, as though the weather had decided to wear a smile without any warmth behind it. Maigret, seated near the back of the little park off Square Clinoncourt, let his pipe go cold in his mouth. He wasn't thinking of the case anymore, because it hadn't been won, but of the silences that had finally begun to thin. He hadn't returned to the office. There was no report to file, no arrest to prepare. Yet the weight of the past week clung to him more than most investigations. There were no villains here, only men who had walked out of rooms too soon, or stood at a window and looked away. He thought of Louis Artaud, still in Lyon, still hoping that a letter unsent might someday become an act of courage. He thought of Lemoine, alone in that train carriage, heading somewhere with no luggage heavier than regret. And he thought of Juliette, always Juliette, seated by the cafe window, writing in a notebook no one had asked about. What had she written? No one ever said. Not even the file had included it. Only that it had been missing from the room. The notebook. That single detail returned now, quiet and insistent, like a misplaced key found hours later at the edge of the desk. No one had ever located it, not in the drawer, not among her things, not in the courtyard, but someone had it. Someone had taken it, either to bury something or to carry it. Maigret stood and walked, slowly, without plan, without route, but his feet knew where to go. Back at the boarding house, Vasseur was reading a newspaper behind the glass of the concierge booth. He looked up and opened the door without speaking, already expecting him. "I thought you might return," he said. Maigret nodded. "Room 5? Empty. No one else since Lemoine? Number. But something odd happened 2 nights ago." Vasseur folded the paper and stood. "I was doing my usual rounds just past midnight. I checked the windows from the back, make sure no one's tried the rear door, and I saw light in room 5. Maigray's brow furrowed. "I thought maybe Lemoyne had come back, or you'd left something. I went up, but the room was locked, and when I opened it, no one inside. No light either." "You're sure?" "I stood in the hallway. The light was real, Inspector. Not the reflection of another room. Just for a moment, then gone." Maigret didn't respond right away. The explanation could have been simple. A flickering bulb in the corridor, a trick of reflected glass. But this wasn't a story that allowed for simple things. He turned toward the stairs. Room 5 was quiet as ever. The air inside had the staleness of recent absence, but there was no trace of intrusion. The bed was still neatly made, the desk bare, and the window closed. He stood by the bed, letting his eyes move slowly across the room, not for fingerprints or fibers. Those had never mattered in this case. He looked for presence, and after a moment, he found it. In the seam behind the old wardrobe, a gap in the wood revealed something thin, a sliver of blue tucked nearly out of sight. He pulled it free gently. A notebook, worn at the corners, the kind found in stationers across Paris. Plain cover, no title. He opened it slowly. The handwriting inside was small, careful, feminine. The first page read, "If anything happens to me, I want someone to know I was here, that I was real, that I tried not to be afraid." He closed the cover, pressing it between his hands as if it were something living. She had written it all down. Juliet hadn't died alone in silence. She had left her voice, just hidden it in the only space she could trust. Not to be found too soon, but not to be lost forever. He left the boarding house and walked straight to the archives, where he requested a private reading room and placed the notebook before him. He didn't take notes. He didn't speak. He read each line slowly. The entries weren't dramatic, no accusations, no detailed names, but the patterns were unmistakable. Mentions of the man with gloves, the quiet one who watched but never helped, the man who promised he'd return and never did. Phrases like, "I don't know if they think I'm stupid, or if they just hope I stay quiet. He told me not to worry, but he took something from me I didn't offer. I wake up with dread, but if I told anyone, I'm afraid they'd call it love." It was all there, the full scope of what had happened, without dramatics, just the steady erosion of a young woman's safety, trust, and finally, hope. By the time he reached the last page, the light outside the archive window had turned grey. "I am not trying to disappear. I just want someone to see me before I do." Maigret closed the notebook and sat back. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel anger. He felt something quieter, deeper, the satisfaction of knowing she had spoken, and that someone had finally heard. He delivered the notebook that evening to the prefecture, along with a short statement. Not as an official file, the case was too old, but as a document of truth, a historical record, so that Juliette Fournier would no longer be a name without context. At home, Madame Maigret greeted him at the door with the warmth of familiarity. She took his coat, kissed his cheek. "You look tired," she said gently. "I am," he said. But he sat with her, and they ate, and they didn't speak of work. Later, she read beside him, and he simply listened to the rustle of the page, to the settling of evening, to the quiet presence of someone who had stayed. Before sleep, he wrote one final note of his own. Not for the file, not for the ministry, just a line, folded into the inside of his desk drawer. She was heard, and then he turned off the light. The days passed quietly. There were no headlines, no trials, no arrests, just a slow, private unwinding of threads that had long been knotted beneath the surface of ordinary life. The kind of resolution that didn't change the world, but gently, firmly, shifted the weight of one small corner of it. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret filed a personal memo, not into an open case folder, but into a drawer labelled Archives Humaines, a place where truth lived not for the courts, but for the record. The notebook was kept there too, in a sealed envelope, along with a short summary in Maigret's own hand. The death of Juliette Fournier, aged 19, presumed suicide in July 1948, has been re-evaluated in light of new testimony and evidence. Psychological coercion, serial exploitation by multiple unnamed adult men, and institutional neglect contributed to her death. No legal charges applicable. Matter closed in law, not in conscience. He didn't sign it as inspector, just Maigret. In the days that followed, a few things changed. Quietly, Lemoine sent word from Marseille. He had taken up work in a bookshop near the harbour. Nothing official, just sorting second-hand volumes and making small conversation with quiet customers. He'd found a kind of rhythm, he said, one that didn't forget. Louis Artaud wrote again, enclosing the letter he had never mailed to Juliette's mother. He asked Maigret to deliver it. The envelope was simple, trembling in its modesty, addressed in careful block letters. Maigret added a short note of his own and posted it. No reply came. He hadn't expected one. And as for Blanchy, the man in the grey coat, whose silence had carried more harm than action, he was never officially named. But rumours reached Maigret weeks later that the antiques shop had shuttered, and the man himself had quietly moved to Belgium. No forwarding address, no announcements. But Maigret knew that kind of departure. It was not escape, it was exile, self-imposed, often worse than prison. One afternoon, Maigret walked alone back to Rue Caulaincourt. It was late summer now, the air carrying a gentler warmth. He didn't stop at the boarding house. Instead, he sat on a bench across the street, beneath the shade of a modest chestnut tree, and looked up at the window of room 5. It was still empty, but not hollow. The room had held pain, yes, but also something more durable. Testimony. Juliette had not vanished without voice. She had, in her quietest moments, left behind the one thing that mattered most, her truth. Hidden not in anger, but in clarity, in the way only someone very young and very brave could tell it. He watched as a bird landed on the windowsill and perched there a moment, then fluttered off. The city went on, unchanged, and yet. Maigret stood, brushing his coat back into shape. A small boy on a scooter passed by, laughing. A woman stepped out of the bakery with a baguette under one arm, glancing briefly toward the upstairs windows. Life continued, but beneath it, Maigret felt something settle, a long-held question finally answered. Juliette had been seen, not just in memory, but in fact, witnessed, and in the end, that had always been the real work, not to punish, but to name, and then to remember. He turned and walked away, his footsteps quiet on the cobblestones, disappearing slowly into the rhythm of the city as the sky above faded to the soft grey of a Paris evening. The ghost at last had spoken, and Maigret, faithful to his trade, had listened. Trade 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 had listened. Trade